Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The sterile hum of the machines echoed through the hospital room, each beep of the monitor a cruel reminder of just how fragile life could be, and Jill Abbott sat by her son's bedside with her hands trembling, her nails digging slightly into her palms as if the pain she inflicted on herself could somehow keep her grounded in the moment. But nothing could stop the flood of emotions that tore through her heart as the doctor's words replayed in her head like a cruel, unrelenting chorus, only a 5% chance of survival, and as she looked at Billy lying there, pale and motionless, tubes running from his body, an oxygen mask covering his face, she couldn't help but feel like the world itself had collapsed around her because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her boy, not to her Billy who had been through so much already, who had faced demons and battled his own reckless impulses, who had made mistakes but always tried to rise above them, and now here he was, caught between life and death, his body fighting a battle that seemed almost impossible to win, and Jill, the woman who had always prided herself on being strong, on carrying herself with fire and defiance, suddenly felt like she was crumbling, as if all the strength she had built up over decades had abandoned her in the moment she needed it most, and the tears that she had tried to hold back for hours finally burst forth as sobs racked her body, her chest heaving as she clutched his limp hand in hers. Whispering words of love, of apology, of desperate pleading, telling him over and over again that he had to wake up, that he had to fight, that he couldn't leave her because she wasn't ready to let go, she would never be ready to let go. And in her mind she kept flashing back to when he was a boy, full of life and stubbornness, running through the house with that mischievous grin that always made her want to scold him but also made her heart swell with pride, and she thought of all the times she had worried about him over the years, his struggles with gambling, his battles with addiction, his reckless choices that had put his life in danger before, and she realized with a sickening twist in her gut that nothing had ever prepared her for this, for the possibility of losing him forever. And as the night stretched on, every second dragging into eternity, she found herself talking to him in long, rambling bursts, telling him stories of their past, reminding him of the family who loved him, of the children who needed him, of the people who still believed in him despite everything, and with each word she prayed that somewhere, somehow, he could hear her, that her voice would become the lifeline pulling him back from the brink, because Jill knew that Billy's heart had always been complicated, always torn between self-destruction and the fierce desire to prove himself, but she also knew that deep down he wanted to live, he wanted to matter, and she clung to that belief like it was the only thing keeping her sane, because the doctors could give their cold statistics, their 5% chance, their reminders that the situation was grim, but Jill refused to let her son be reduced to a number, refused to let the odds dictate his fate, and as the hours turned into dawn, with the first faint light of morning slipping through the blinds, she sat exhausted but unyielding, her face stained with tears, her voice hoarse from speaking, but her resolve fierce as ever, because if Billy Abbott had even the slightest chance to open his eyes, Jill was going to be right there waiting, pouring every ounce of her love and strength into him, refusing to give up on him, no matter what anyone said, no matter how impossible it seemed, because a mother's love was stronger than fear, stronger than despair, stronger than any statistic, and Jill knew in her heart that if anyone could defy the odds, it was her Billy. The clock on the sterile white wall seemed frozen, each tick louder than the last, as if time itself were mocking Jill Abbott while she sat hunched in the stiff plastic chair beside Billy's hospital bed, clutching his limp hand with both of hers like it was the only thread tethering him to this world, her knuckles white from the pressure, her eyes red and swollen from hours of weeping, though the tears never seemed to stop because every time she tried to wipe them away another wave of grief came crashing through her, and she couldn't shake the doctor's words, those clinical, detached words that were meant to prepare her for the worst but instead cut her open and left her raw, 5% survival, as though her son, her boy, the child she had brought into this world with all her imperfections and fierce determination, could be boiled down to a statistic, a percentage, a number on a chart. And the thought of it made her sick to her stomach because Billy was so much more than that. He was flesh and blood, he was laughter and mistakes, he was triumphs and tragedies all rolled into one complicated man, and he was hers, her son, no matter what he had done or how many times they had clashed, he had always been her heart walking around outside her body, vulnerable to the world, and now lying so still he looked almost lifeless, and Jill hated it, hated seeing him like this, hated the tubes that forced oxygen into his lungs, hated the 4 lines that pumped medication into his veins, hated the machines that beeped with cold indifference, reminding her with each rhythm that he was not safe, that he was in peril, and she felt powerless, something she had never tolerated in her life, because Jill Foster Abbott had always been a fighter, a woman who took on anyone who tried to cross her, who fought for what she wanted, for her place in Genoa City, for her family, for her company, but here, in this antiseptic room, she couldn't fight the enemy, she couldn't punch or outwit or outmaneuver death, and so she cried, she begged, she bargained with whatever higher power might be listening, her voice breaking as she whispered into Billy's ear about all the reasons he needed to come back, reminding him of Delia, reminding him of Johnny and Katie, reminding him that his story wasn't finished, that he had too much left to do, too much left to prove, and then her mind would drift into memories that came unbidden, like old film reels flashing across her consciousness, Billy as a boy, with messy hair and mischievous eyes, laughing as he ran through the Abbott estate, getting into trouble with Jack or pestering Tracy, or sitting on the stairs pouting because he hadn't gotten his way, and Jill could almost hear his little voice calling out for her, could almost feel the way his small arms used to wrap around her waist, and the ache of it all made her sob harder, because what if that was all she had left, just memories, just echoes of the past, and the thought of losing him forever was like a blade twisting in her chest, sharp and merciless, and yet she clung stubbornly to hope, because to let go of hope was to admit defeat, and Jill Abbott had never been one to admit defeat, even when the odds were stacked against her, so she kept talking to him, kept telling him about the family who were just outside in the waiting room, about how Jack had been pacing like a caged animal, how Tracy had tried to keep everyone calm with her gentle voice but couldn't hide the tears in her own eyes, how Lily had been praying silently, holding her hands so tightly together that her knuckles turned white, how even Chance had come by to check in, looking grim but supportive, because whether or not they always got along, Billy mattered to all of them, he was loved, and she needed him to know that, needed him to hold on to it if he could hear her somewhere in the darkness he was trapped in, because maybe, just maybe, that love could be the light to guide him back, and in the rare quiet moments when exhaustion threatened to pull her under, Jill found herself spiraling through regrets, through the long complicated history she had with Billy, the times she had been too hard on him, the times she had judged him too harshly or failed to understand him, and she whispered apologies through her sobs, telling him she should have been better, that she should have done more, that she wasn't ready to lose him, and she thought about how cruel life could be, how it had already stolen so much from him, from all of them, how losing Delia had shattered him in ways he had never fully recovered from, and Jill couldn't stomach the idea that fate would be so merciless as to rob him of another chance. To rob her of her son when there was still so much life left unlived, and she remembered the doctor's cautious tone when he had explained the severity of the injuries, the way he had looked at her with eyes that had seen too many families broken by bad news, and she had wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he didn't know her Billy, didn't know his spirit, didn't know the stubborn streak that could keep him alive when all logic said he shouldn't be, because Billy had always been a survivor. No matter how many times he crashed, no matter how many times he fell, and Jill held on to that belief with everything in her because she had to, because the alternative was unbearable, and so the night became a blur of whispered prayers and broken sobs, of gripping his hand and brushing back his hair, of pleading with him to squeeze her hand, to give her any sign that he was still in there, and when the nurses came in to check his vitals, Jill's heart stopped every time, fearing the worst, her breath catching in her throat until they nodded that there was no change, and though no change wasn't good news, it wasn't the end either, and Jill took what small comfort she could, telling herself that as long as there was breath in his body, there was hope, and so she stayed. She refused to leave his side even when they suggested she rest, refused to move from that chair even as her back ached and her legs cramped, because she had promised herself that when he opened his eyes, and she told herself it was when, not if, the first thing he would see would be her, his mother, there waiting, ready to fight for him, ready to love him, and though fear gnawed at her like a ravenous beast, she held on, she endured, because that was what Billy needed from her now, and Jill knew that no matter how small the odds, miracles happened, and she was not about to stop believing in one for her son. The hallway outside Billy's room was thick with tension, every hushed conversation between nurses and doctors sending waves of dread through the Abbott family as they gathered in uncomfortable silence, each of them coping in their own way with the unbearable weight of not knowing if Billy would ever wake up, and while Jill refused to leave his bedside, clutching his hand as though sheer force of will could keep him tethered to this world, Jack had taken on the role of restless sentinel, pacing back and forth like a man possessed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes bloodshot from both exhaustion and the tears he kept trying to swallow back because Jack Abbott had always been the protector, the one who shouldered the family's burdens, and yet here he was helpless, unable to protect his younger brother from the cruel hand fate had dealt, and the helplessness was eating him alive, reminding him of all the times he had failed Billy before, all the times he had tried to pull him back from the brink only to watch Billy stumble again and again, and though part of him was angry that Billy's recklessness had led them here, angry that their family was once again gathered in a hospital because of choices that spiraled out of control, that anger was dwarfed by love, by fear, by the raw, aching need for his brother to live, and he would have traded places with Billy in a heartbeat if he could, because as much as they fought, as much as their relationship had been marred by betrayals and misunderstandings, Jack loved him with a fierceness that defied words, and he couldn't imagine Genoa City, couldn't imagine his life, without Billy in it. Tracy, ever the heart of the family, sat quietly in the waiting area, her hands clasped in her lap as silent tears rolled down her cheeks, her mind drifting between memories of happier times and the crushing weight of the present, and though she tried to be strong for everyone, offering gentle words to reassure Kyle, comforting Ashley when she grew sharp with worry, Tracy's heart was breaking because she had always had a soft spot for Billy, always believed in his better angels even when he didn't, and the thought of losing him now felt unbearable, another wound the Abbotts might never recover from, and so she prayed silently, not for the first time that night, asking for strength, asking for a miracle, whispering to herself that Billy had to pull through because their family had endured so much loss already. Meanwhile, in the room itself, Jill's sobs had quieted into a low, steady hum of grief, her voice raw as she continued talking to her son, her words spilling out in a desperate monologue that only paused when the machines beeped louder or when a nurse came to check his vitals, and though the medical staff remained professional, Jill could see the guarded pity in their eyes, the way they avoided giving her false hope, and she hated them for it, hated the statistics they quoted, the charts they studied, the percentages they offered as though they knew Billy's spirit, as though they understood the fire that burned inside her son, and she wanted to scream at them that they were wrong, that they didn't know him like she did, that Billy Abbott had been counted out too many times in life only to come back swinging, and this time would be no different, because Jill refused to accept any other outcome, she refused to believe that fate would be cruel enough to take him from her now. Ashley arrived not long after, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floor, her arms folded tightly across her chest as she surveyed the scene, her eyes flashing with both anger and fear, because Ashley had always had a complicated relationship with Billy, had often doubted him, criticized him, held him to standards he could never quite meet, but in this moment, all of that fell away, replaced by the visceral terror of possibly losing her brother, and she found herself snapping at the nurses, demanding updates, demanding to know why more wasn't being done, her frustration spilling over into sharp words that made Kyle flinch and caused Tracy to gently remind her that lashing out wouldn't change the situation, but Ashley couldn't help it, because underneath her sharp edges was a woman terrified of grief, terrified of another hole in their already fractured family, and as she stood staring at the door to Billy's room, she whispered under her breath that he had better not give up, that he had better fight, because she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Kyle, standing nearby, was pale and shaken, his usual confidence stripped away as he watched his family crumble around him, and though he hadn't always understood his uncle, he had looked up to him in ways he didn't often admit, and the idea of losing him made Kyle's stomach churn, and so he clung to Summer, who had come as soon as she heard, her hand resting gently on his arm, her presence a steady comfort in the chaos. Back inside, Jill's grief became waves, crashing and receding, her voice at times strong and demanding as she ordered Billy to wake up. And at other times barely a whisper, a broken plea from a mother who couldn't fathom life without her son, and in those moments, memories overwhelmed her, memories of fights and reconciliations, of laughter and heartbreak, of the time she had first held him as a newborn and marveled that she had created something so perfect, of the first time he had called her mom with that little boy voice that had melted her heart, of all the chances she had given him, and all the times he had tested her patience, and yet through it all, her love had never wavered, and it would not waver now. Hours bled together, the night stretching endlessly, dawn breaking only to give way to another day of waiting, of not knowing, and every time the doctor entered, Jill's heart stopped, her breath caught in her throat, because she was terrified of the words that might come next, terrified that at any moment they might tell her it was over, and so she held tighter to Billy's hand, pressing her forehead to it, whispering that she wasn't ready, that he couldn't leave her, that he was stronger than this, that he had too much to live for, and somewhere in the depths of her soul she swore she felt the faintest squeeze, the barest flicker of movement, and though it could have been her imagination, Jill seized on it like a lifeline, her sobs transforming into frantic pleas as she begged him to do it again, begged him to fight, begged him to come back, because she had to believe that he heard her, that he was still in there, that love could still pull him back from the abyss. Just when the suffocating silence of the room began to feel unbearable, the shrill alarm of the heart monitor shattered it, the rapid beeping slicing through Jill's fog of grief like a knife, and for one paralyzing second she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, her blood running cold as her eyes shot to the jagged lines on the screen, and panic consumed her as a team of nurses and a doctor rushed in, their calm urgency a horrifying contrast to the storm exploding inside her chest, and Jill stumbled back, her hands flying to her mouth as she cried out Billy's name, her voice raw with terror. "Don't you dare leave me, not now, not like this." She pressed herself against the wall as the staff worked feverishly, calling out numbers and orders Jill barely understood, their bodies blocking her view of her son, and in that helpless moment she thought she might shatter completely, her knees buckling as she clung to the wall for support, hot tears streaming down her cheeks, because the nightmare she had been bracing herself for was no longer a shadow lurking in the corners of her mind, it was here, unfolding before her eyes, and the weight of it was crushing. Jack barreled into the room seconds later, his face pale as chalk, his hand gripping Jill's arm to steady her, whispering fiercely that Billy was a fighter, that he wouldn't give up, but his voice trembled and betrayed the fear in his own heart, and Jill clung to her eldest son like a lifeline, sobbing into his shoulder as the machines continued to scream, as the words 5% echoed louder in her head, mocking her hope. Time twisted cruelly, stretching each second into eternity, until at last the doctor barked an order, and the noise began to settle, the monitor finding a rhythm again, weak but steady, and Jill nearly collapsed with relief, her legs trembling as she stumbled back to Billy's bedside, grabbing his hand with desperate urgency as if afraid he might slip away again if she let go for even an instant. "Don't you ever do that to me again," she whispered fiercely, her tears falling onto his skin, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "You are not leaving me, do you hear me? You stay. You fight. You come back to me." The medical team assured her that for now he was stable, though the battle was far from over, and Jill nodded numbly, not really hearing them, her focus entirely on Billy, her thumb stroking the back of his hand, her lips pressed to his knuckles as she rocked slightly in her chair, whispering over and over again that she loved him, that she needed him, that she would not let go, and though exhaustion dragged at her body, her eyes never left his face, searching desperately for any flicker, any sign, any miracle that her boy was still in there, still fighting to return to her.